have the great pleasure in introducing Sidney Dekker. I don't even know if you need an introduction, Sid, but either way, I will give you a good one. So Sidney Dekker is a professor and director of the Safety Science Innovation Lab in Brisbane, Australia. And also he's the professor at the Faculty of Aerospace Engineering at Delft University in the Netherlands. Sidney has lived and worked in 7 countries across 4 different continents, is fluent in a number of languages, and has won worldwide acclaim for his groundbreaking work in human factors and safety. Sidney coined the term safety differently back in 2012, and this has since turned into a global movement for change, which we are all familiar with, and it encourages organisations to declutter their bureaucracy and set people free to make things go well. And if they don't, we offer compassion, restoration and learning in those cases. So many of the ideas today, Sidney is responsible for bringing them to us, and I am definitely grateful for that, Sid. He's an absolute game changer, and he's written a ton of books, and if you haven't read at least one of them, well, you've got some catching up to do, I think. Now, I think I'll suggest, Sidney, that maybe your best work has been the Doing Safety Differently documentary that we collaborated on back in 2019. Hopefully you'll agree with me. If you haven't seen that, you can go and find it. Shameless plug. Thank you, Sid. So everyone, please sit back and enjoy listening to Professor Sidney Dekker. Over to you, Sid.
Kim, thank you very much. Yes, Doing Safety Differently. We are still supposed to write the book, right, to get that out. There needs to be a book to support the film. But then again, you can watch the film. It's freely available. Doing Safety Differently, number 3 or 4 in a lineup of documentaries. But colleagues, I won't spend a lot of time blabbing on a soliloquy. There are other fora for me to do that. I am not a safety professional. I never have been a safety professional. I never had the aspiration to be a safety professional. But it's interesting to recognize that Dave Woods is not a safety professional. Erik Holnagel is not a safety professional. Jens Rasmussen is not a safety professional. Paul Fitz was not a safety professional. Even Heinrich was not a safety professional. He was an insurance salesman. And so, perhaps the interesting aspect of this is that many of the innovations and the novelty and the ideas, the scholarship that we run off of and have a long, extended conversation about on a day like today, come from people who are not doing the work that needs doing with those ideas. And in that sense, I don't know whether we are the movers or shakers, Kim, or whether the people who actually try to run with these ideas, like many people on the call, are actually the real movers and shakers. Yes, of course, we have a role of creating imagined worlds of possibility and shifting the dial on how people might think about certain things by asking difficult questions and creating some concepts that allow them to think differently. Or as Levi Strauss would tell us, is this good to think with, right? Is this a good concept to think with? Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. 3 of these concepts, though, safety 2, safety differently, and work as imagined versus work as done, all emerged around 2012, which is interesting. I don't know what made that year particularly productive, but it followed closely on the heels of the meeting that John Green commented on previously, the meeting in the famous meeting in Melbourne that I don't think has a name. Perhaps we should, John, think of a name that somehow locks that meeting into history. But 2012, Safety 2 was developed by Erik Holnagel, as you know. The difference between work as imagined versus work as done was presented by him in 2012, first at a meeting in Germany in that very year. And of course, Safety Differently as a label, still with a comma between safety, comma, differently, was born in an email to a part of the group in 2012 as well. What they all have in common is, of course, to shift this the idea about safety as stopping things from going wrong and bureaucratizing them so that they cannot go wrong, or at least we won't be blamed if they do go wrong. To shift that and flip it around and say safety is about making things go well and identifying and enhancing the capacities that make it so. Now, as Ralph, I think, very clearly reminds us, none of that is really very new. Humanity has always struggled with the tension between centralizing and decentralizing, between giving people freedom and initiative and devolution of decision authority and holding it all back, and centralizing and pushing it up the hierarchy, because of how accountability relationships shift and change and sit in that particular moment in history. So these struggles and battles are nothing new, and in some sense they're trivial and intuitive and not very innovative to think about. Go back to theory X versus theory Y, right, which Doug McGregor wrote about in the U.S. in the 1960s, and yet it is standing on the shoulders of work like von Moltke, the Prussian commander who talked about Auftragstaktik, right? Giving your underlings the freedom to accomplish the mission and the goal of the mission as they see fit and as the situation emerges, as long as what they're doing is consistent with the overarching goal that you have in mind. Of course, Ralph is intimately familiar with those sorts of approaches, which itself sits in a military history and a history of command and control that goes back even much further, all the way to Lao Tzu and even beyond. We can even go to discussions about suffering and invoking a world in which we can end all suffering, as Fred and I did earlier this morning, which also goes back to ideas and writings that go back 2,000 years. Now, the central notions, though, of how to do these things, to declutter, we've talked about that, to decentralize, right? So that is to take decision authority and put it to the place where decisions actually meet the frontline conditions where they need to be made. And then once it's there, devolve it down to the lowest possible decision level authority that you can find, closest to the front line. Decluttering, decentralizing, devolving, those sorts of concepts. Now, the question that comes up, though, on a day like today is, can this be done safely? Can we do this safely? And I would love to give you the answer, which is yes, you can do this safely. And there's a number of reasons why you can do this safely. One is, Ron talked about this. We've talked about this before. I came up with the idea of micro-experimenting, I think, back in 2013, 2014, right? Begin small, call it a micro-experiment, which also means bring an experimental mindset, not a change mindset, because what you had in mind of changing may not be the thing that needs changing. So be on a discovery, be open-minded, be curious, have this curious experimental mindset of discovery and learning rather than of change and control from above. So yes, it can be done safely. But it's interesting to recognize that two of the people who were in the 5 remaining ones, the last standing after the Melbourne meeting back in more than a decade ago, as John said, remember this was John Green was there, Michael Tuma was there, Daniel Humerdal was there, Kelvin Genn was there, and I was there after lunch. 5 out of, I think we started with 40. So that just, cuts your ego back to size immediately. But it's interesting, when you look at who was there, the 5, Daniel Humerdal has gone on to join a regulator and do incredibly important and good work inside of a regulator, mind you. Michael Tuma, of course, is as crucial as ever in his role as a health and safety lawyer, and super instrumental in this country and beyond in changing the way safety gets done legally. Of course, Kelvin Genn went on to set up his consulting company doing safety differently. John Green, we know, has infected and contaminated and lit fires across the corporate world in various places across the globe. And I just keep on writing books. But which you don't read. Well, you might. But I write them quicker than you can read them. So these 5 roles are really quite important, right? So these, well, I don't know about the academic, but the legal, the corporate, the regulator, the consultant. Now let's briefly look at 2 of them to briefly explore that question: can we do this safely? Right? Well, let's first look at the regulator. What would the regulator say? Can you do this safely? Would the regulator push back? In my experience, regulators don't push back. Regulators actually, well, they're people too, as we know, but they're interested in new ideas around this space. They also recognize and understand that there's an asymptote, that some recipes no longer really yield more insight, that doing more of the same will give you more of the same, not something new. And so that's quite useless to keep doing. They are interested in hearing these new ideas. We found this very quickly when we did the Woolworths experiment, which of course you might have seen in the film, Safety Differently. Regulator took about 18 months to convince, but were very interested in seeing what was going to happen. And the results of that are resonating even today. So the other thing to recognize is that, of course, the regulator, and John said as much, is not the problem. The regulator is not the problem. We've lived under neoliberal rule for the last 20, 30, 40 years in which deregulation and market forces and a withdrawing government, retreating government, have been the mantras, which means that the regulatory presence, the footprint has shrunk. It's self-regulation, performance-based self-regulation that actually creates most of the trouble, as John says. The statistics are there to back him up. Most worlds sit around 60% of all the rules that you're following today, you made up yourself. 40% comes to the regulator. If you're in healthcare, 85% of the rules that you're following, you made up yourself. Only 15% comes from regulators of various kinds. 85%. We've got nurses following 600 policies, well, supposedly following 600 policies in this country every day. Yet when you ask them, right, as Macquarie University showed us, they will be able to tell you about 2 or 3 of those policies. 597 of those policies are unknown to them. No idea. It doesn't mean anything for them in their daily work in keeping patients safe. And so it's us. We create these rules. So don't hide behind a regulator. All right. I was having this conversation with somebody in Victoria yesterday. He said, well, we have to do all these swims. And I go, what do you mean you have to do all these swims? Says who? Who says you have to do all these swims? And it's actually Kim Bancroft who gave me the courage to challenge him on this and say, where does it say so? Right? That would be the Bancroftian question to ask, right, Kim? Right? The Bancroftian question is, show me the reg, show me the rule, show me the statute that says that you have to do a swim. There is none. There actually is none. There isn't even one that tells you that you have to investigate everything that goes wrong. You make this up. You tell yourself that you have to do this. You tell your client or your contractor that you need to do this. But the regulator is not telling you this. It also means that the lawyer cannot tell you to do these things. All right? And that takes me to Michael Tuma. This takes me to, can you do safety differently, safely? And the answer is yes, because when you look at jurisprudence and companies that have got in trouble with health and safety in this country and others over the past, say, 10 years, 99.9% of cases really are only about one thing, and that's duty of care. It's not violation of any other statutes or regulation or law or legislation. It is duty of care. That's what you get nailed on. Now, you tell me that everything we've talked about today has nothing to do with increasing our duty of care. What better way to show your duty of care, colleagues, is there than showing that you care? That you care, that you want to know what's going on, that you want to help people succeed, that you want to set people up for success, that you want to invest in forward-looking accountability, that you want to ask what people need to do their work even better. What more is there that you can do to show that you give a damn, that you actually care? Oh, we did the numbers, we're driving them to zero, we're paying bonuses for those who don't show any incidents. Is that living up to your duty of care? Is that showing care? Or is that showing a cynical callousness to what really should be the ethical commitment of safety? That's the question I want to ask you in closing. And finally, if we ask this question, can we do safety differently safely? What bizarre imagined world are we living in to begin with? Because safety differently is going on every day, right under your noses. Otherwise, work doesn't get done. It is what René Alberti calls this native resilience. The native resilience that resides in these capacities of people to recognize risk, to keep that discussion about risk alive, for people to be information hungry and curious and invest in diversity in this conversation. Safety differently is going on every day, right there in your business. The question is, are we capable of creating the structures, curiosity, and as Ron said, the courage to engage with it, learn from it, be real about it, and actually take legal and regulatory stakeholders with us on the journey? Or do we want to hide behind paperwork and say, we've got it under control, we're fine, I'll get my next corporate gig next year? The choice is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. Thank you for that summary and that journey. I was sort of captivated through the last 15 minutes or so. And so it's time to wrap up our ForgeWorks Safety Innovation Summit.